We've undergone a bit of a cold snap in the UK recently, and that's made it really difficult to work in the workshop at the end of my garden, partly because it's just so damn cold, but also because the temperature does have an effect on the silicone and the resin that I typically use. So in this video I was hoping to be able to fully complete this sculpture, make the mould, cast it and paint it, but because of the cold weather I've had to leave off making the mould of the sculpture, and so in this video we're just going to be concentrating on the sculpture process itself. So you may recognise this skull as one of those that I made in a previous video a few months ago. Now, as I've mentioned on a few occasions, skulls are really versatile, and so I've found myself using them for a number of different projects. So for this one, I was looking at it and thinking, well, I could actually use that in a sculpture. If I was going to do a zombie sculpture, I could use that as the basis and then sculpt over the skull, almost as though it were one of those anatomical recreations that you'll often see from crime scene investigations or archaeological digs. So I thought that might be quite a fun project, and it might even be a bit of a time saver because obviously you've got a lot of the structure in place already. So what I've done is to attach the skull to a bit of aluminium armature wire here. I'm just starting to build up the sculpture by adding some monster clay onto the skull. Now, one thing that I didn't do in the previous skull mould making video that I made was to actually make a jaw for the skull. Now, I had sculpted this up, I just hadn't quite got around to making the mould. So for this one I wanted it to be a complete face, so I've gone and cast up a jaw. And for this one I'm sort of thinking the jaw could be a bit dislocated perhaps, and give him a bit of a distorted face. So at the minute that looks a bit goofy, but it should look a bit better once I've got a bit more flesh on the bones. So I'm just putting some clay in place here to hold the jaw in the correct position. Now I must confess that I'm not exactly doing the muscles in the correct fashion here. I don't know the name of every single muscle or even that I'm putting them in the correct place, but most of this is going to be covered with skin, so I'm just sort of putting in the basics here. The idea being that there'll be some gaps in the skin and some injuries and things, so you can sort of see the muscles showing through from beneath. So I don't think you need to be super anatomically precise here, although obviously I'm trying to make it look as accurate as I can. So the eye I'm using here is actually an ox's eye, or a cow's eye, and it's got one of those sort of elongated pupils in it. It's not going to matter really once I've made the mould, obviously you won't see any of the details, but it's about the right shape. And one of the things I'm trying to do with this is, as you can see, the skull's painted, and I'm using sort of dark brown, sort of reddy monster clay for the muscles. So I'm sort of trying to get a degree of pigmentation into the sculpture just by dint of the materials that I'm using. So having the eye there does add a certain something to it. So now that I've got some of the musculature in place, I'm now just shaping those with some rakes to get the basic underlying shapes down. So I mentioned that I was trying to keep a degree of pigmentation, a bit of coloration in the sculpture just by the types of materials I was using. Now, you may have noticed I've recently had to go with some grey monster clay, so I thought it would look really cool if I used a sort of brown monster clay for the muscles and used a grey monster clay for the skin. So what I'm now doing is coming in and adding a layer of grey monster clay over the entire sculpture as a skin layer. And once I've got the shapes done there, I can then come in and do the skin texture and all of the other zombie-ish features that you would normally expect. Once again, I found this slightly tricky. I have had a go at doing zombies previously in the past. You may remember this guy from a couple of years ago now. And I commented at the time that I found it quite tricky to do the zombie sculpture. The reason being is because the zombie's got like bits of his face missing. So some of the features that you would normally use to gauge the correct proportions from are missing. And particularly in this case, the face is also distorted because the jaw is dislocated. So it actually made the process a little bit tricky because, you know, he hasn't got a nose, so you couldn't really gauge how well the face is looking because there wasn't a nose there, so that really made the face look a bit weird. Similarly with the jaw, because it's off to the side, I wasn't quite sure how to do that and how that should really look. So again, a bit of trial and error, just adding blobs of monster clay here and there, trying to get the right shapes down. Now the top and the back of the head was a little bit easier. There's only a very thin layer of skin on top of the skull, of course, so that was relatively simple to do. So I'm just using a spatula to put some very soft monster clay on the head that I've softened in the microwave. The mouth in particular was something that I went back and forth on quite a lot. I mean, obviously half of it's missing, you know, it's missing most of his lower lip, and part of the side of the mouth is missing as well, so it was kind of difficult to get the right expression. I mean, obviously you want him to look sort of a bit weird because he's a zombie and he's missing all his features, but it did make it quite difficult from a sculptural point of view to sort of try and guess how that should look. The back of the head and the neck was sort of looking like one big flat shape, so I've added some spine detail there and also a fold at the base of the skull just to add a bit more detail to the sculpture. Makes it look a bit more natural, I think. Now I've got a lot of the basic shapes in now, so I'm now coming in with a rake and starting to smooth out the main surfaces of the zombie. So I'm now starting to add in some of the details, and I'm cutting some lines into the forehead. I want him to look like he's sort of screaming a little bit, or sort of, you know, scrunching his face up in that sort of angry way. So I'm just trying to cut in some lines to try and imply that. Now after a while I actually decided that he didn't look angry enough, so what I'm doing here is cutting into the forehead and pushing down with the sculpting tool onto some of the clay to try and lower his brow and sort of scrunch up the skin slightly. That does have the advantage of the clay actually compressing in quite a natural way, so sometimes that's quite a nice way of getting some natural folds in the clay. Sometimes it looks a little bit more natural than you could necessarily accomplish by sort of sculpting it from scratch. And as with everything else, I'm just smoothing things out with a rake once I'm happy with the basic shapes. Using finer and finer grades of rake really helps smooth things out. And as you can see here, I'm also using one of my new favourite sculpting tools, which is this reticulated sponge. So I'm just using that to further smooth the clay out. Something that I've done on previous sculptures is to actually heat the sculpting tool to melt the monster clay. I find that gives you quite a natural look. I find it useful for some of these bits of flesh that are showing from beneath the skin. Find you get quite a natural look if the clay's a bit melted. So I'm just using a tea light to do that. One disadvantage of this is because it's a candle, it does make your sculpting tools black. I guess some of the carbon from the flame collects on it. So won't be a problem for the mould, of course, but just something to bear in mind. So this is something I did quite extensively for this sculpture, and that was to cover it in food wrap and then sculpt and press with the sponges into the clay to add in skin detail. The food wrap just smooths out the details that you're cutting in and gives you quite a natural look. Now, given this was a zombie, I thought it was a good opportunity to start experimenting with some different textures as well. So what I'm doing here is melting the monster clay with a hairdryer, then adding the food wrap back on and pressing in again with the sponges. I was hoping this might give me a slightly more extreme sort of texture pattern on the clay. I think that's kind of cool. It's sort of done something. I was careful to actually make sure there were some folds in the food wrap when I pressed in, hoping to get a sort of a folded skin type texture, and I think that looks kind of cool actually. It's not too extreme, but it does look quite natural. So what I've also decided to do is to extend the neck of the sculpture down a little bit, so just to show a little bit of the chest as well. Thought it was just a good opportunity to have some additional skin texture in there. So one technique that I've used on my previous sculptures as well, but I find quite useful, is to cut in folds of skin on the neck like this, and then just use a long bristle brush to smooth it out. So after a bit of experimentation, that sort of ended up being my sort of standard process. So what I would do would be to cut in lots of small lines. I'd then brush them down, smooth them out. I'd then put the food wrap over that texture and then press in with a reticulated sponge. And I found that a really useful technique. So all that meant was I had folded skin detail in there and then some further skin texture pressed onto those folds. And I found that a really effective process, so I can see myself using this on future sculptures as well. So now just to add the rest of the texture to the face. Now I actually ended up building up a little bit more of the nose. I found that was needed just to make the face sell a little bit more, just to sort of hint at what was there, so the fact that it was missing maybe seemed a little bit more obvious. It also helped the rest of the face read a little bit easier, I think. Now one thing that I do need to consider is the mouth. As you can see, the teeth there are misaligned, but there's a cavity between them. Now when I come to make my mould, of course, the silicon's going to get in there, and because it's quite a large cavity I could end up using quite a lot of silicone inside the mouth, so I need to fill in that gap just so that the mould will be one continuous shape. So I'm just pressing some more monster clay in there between the teeth and just trying to sculpt that in so it looks relatively natural. Obviously once you come to paint the cast you can put some black in there to sort of hide that, so that should make things a little bit easier. It's just one of the drawbacks of having a sculpture that you're not going to mould and having a sculpture that you are going to mould. You do need to sort of think about where the silicone is going to go and how that's ultimately going to be able to be cast in the final process, so just something to bear in mind when you're making these. Now finally I've got these exposed areas of skull at the top of the head, and I wasn't too happy with the way the edges of the skin was looking, so what I ended up doing was again using some food wrap over the sculpture, but I just started pressing in with lots of different things, and I actually pulled out this texture stamp that I made in a previous video some time ago. It's got quite a sort of an extreme texture to it, but I thought maybe through the food wrap that would be okay, and actually pressing in with the sharp edges and sort of really messing about with the clay actually yielded quite a realistic look to this, so I was quite happy with that in the end. I wanted the top of the head to have a fair amount of damage to it because it's got all these exposed areas of skull. I figured there could have been quite a lot of trauma there, so I figured the skin should look quite bashed up and sort of destroyed. So I've just made sure to add a lot of interesting texture to that, so when I come to paint it I can get an interesting look to it. Right, so there we go, there's one zombie sculpture. Quite pleased with that one, looks kind of cool I think. Always good to do a zombie every now and again. And as I said at the beginning of the video, just another example of how versatile skulls are. I've got a few other ideas to use them as well, so I can see that this is going to be something I'm going to find myself using frequently. But I'll leave it there for this one. Obviously I need to mould it, cast it and paint it as well, so there'll be a second part to this once the weather actually gets a little bit warmer. But for the time being, thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Thanks very much for watching. I'll be posting more videos on this project and others, so if you'd like to keep up with what's going on, please do subscribe. Alternatively, you can visit my website, which is www.thedarkpower.com, or you can find me on Facebook, just search for The Dark Power.